Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goodman, Director of Marketing and Development for the YMCA of Northwest Louisiana. We're here at 318 Latino Studios for Shreveport-Bossier, my city, my community, my home. And I'm super excited to have today's discussion. Our guest is John Atkins. John.
Thank you for having me, Jeffrey.
Of course. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. So we'll hop in. I'll go ahead and fess and say this, John. You've long been one of the people I really look up to in town.
That's kind of you to say. Thank you.
So let's start here if we could. Start by telling me today what role your family, the Atkins family, played in bringing Centenary College to Shreveport back in 1908.
Well, that's a long story. I'll try not to take up too much time with that question, but it's an interesting story. I actually did a talk for Founders Day at Centenary a few years ago, and they had asked me to look into our connection with the college. So I looked back at some of the obituaries of my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my uncle, and tried to put that story together and reflected back on family lore and dinner table conversation. So forgive me, I can't say that this information has been vetted, but to my best knowledge, that story it began like in 1886. And forgive me if I'm going to be citing this from memory, but it's been a while since I went through that talk. But in 1886, my great-grandfather, John Baxter Atkins, there's several John Baxter Atkins in our family. I'm John Edward Atkins, but I have a cousin, John Baxter Atkins III, who's actually John Baxter Atkins IV, because there was a junior who became a senior and that type of deal. But in 1886, my great-grandfather, John Baxter Atkins, and his brother moved from Mississippi, I think they were in Canton, Mississippi, to Lake Inn, Louisiana, where they bought a small retail store, a 36-foot by 36-foot store that was on the railroad there in Lake Inn, Louisiana. And they began a mercantile operation in 1886. And they must have been pretty good at what they did, because I saw in my great-grandfather's obituary, it made reference to the fact that in 1903, that enterprise had grown to 10 stores up and down the Red River, 30,000 acres of cotton land, something like 13 cotton gins, and several mules and plows and lots of other assorted accoutrements. And they had a revenue in 1903 of $1 million, which sounds great. They certainly had grown their business. They also had 2 paddle wheelers that took product from their farming operations down to New Orleans and exchange that for dry good products that then bring back up to their 10 stores that were all connected by telegraph up and down the Red River. So they had quite an operation, but apparently they also had quite a bit of debt, and so that was a challenge. And I can't remember the exact year, but the boll weevil had crossed over the Rio Grande from Mexico and was working its way up East Texas towards Louisiana, and you could kind of track it. It was like a topographic map. Each year, the boll weevil would cover another 50 or 100 miles, and they would just track it on the way up. So my great-grandfather and his brother had a big operation, but a fair amount of debt, and they had the boll weevil coming into their, threatening in the future their operating area. So they were looking ahead and planning ahead, and they had bought some acreage, about 260 acres south of what was then south of Shreveport. It's kind of just diversifying their portfolio. And then in 1907, we had I'm trying to make sure it was at 06 or 07 that we had the San Francisco earthquake, and that led to a financial crisis of 1907, and so because 3/4 of San Francisco burned down, it was destroyed by earthquake or the associated fires, and so all this money was going into San Francisco to rebuild San Francisco. So the banks are all getting stressed, and the insurance companies are all getting stressed. And so what when you're in a financial crisis, what does a bank do? Well, it starts looking around and determining where it has loans that are at risk, and they see this mercantile and farming operation in the path of the boll weevil, and they start calling my great-grandfather's loans. So, to their credit, my great-grandfather and his brother were able to pay off their loans over the course of about a year, but they were basically busted at the end of it. They had to sell all their stores, sold most of their land in Lake End, and paid off their loans, and moved to Shreveport, and where they had this 260-acre tract that they were trying to figure out how to leverage that into a fresh start. And so my great-grandfather was on the board of the Methodist Church, the Louisiana Methodist Church, and he was aware of Centenary College. It was then located in Jackson, Louisiana, in the Florida parishes. And he knew that Jackson, Louisiana was struggling and that Centenary College was struggling. It had been founded there in 1825. And Shreveport was kind of in the beginning of a boom. The Caddo Pine Island oil field was in the very early days, and there was lots of promise in Shreveport at the time. And so my great-grandfather was able to negotiate a deal with the Board of Trustees of Centenary College and the United Methodist Church that if they would move Centenary College from Jackson, Louisiana to Shreveport, that he and his partners would donate 40 acres of land for their campus and help them raise the money to build their 4 additional new buildings. So that's how Centenary College came to Shreveport, and it arrived in 1908. And as you might have noticed, when we mentioned that Centenary was founded in 1825, next year is, of course, the bicentennial of Centenary College. So that's an important event in the history of the college.
Wow, yeah. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
And the town, you said, just for clarification, where your great-grandfather and his brother were, it's what?
Lake End. If you drive south on 49, like you're going to Natchitoches,
okay,
you'll see it about 45 miles, 50 miles or so south of Shreveport.
Lake, and 2 words.
Lake End.
E-N-D.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I didn't really know. I mean, I'm embarrassed. I didn't really know that Centenary's original location was Jackson, Louisiana until probably the last 24 months or so. Mm-hmm. And I would think most people aren't aware of that.
Yeah, well, it's an important piece of the college's history. It spent, the first, 80 some odd years down there. But the Civil War, the college shut down during the Civil War, and then was restarted after the war and was able to hang in there for a number of decades because of the persistence and hard work of the president of the college during that post-war period. But at the end of the day, the demographics of the Florida parishes weren't working in its favor, so it relocated.
And are they doing something special for the bicentennial?
There's a bicentennial committee hard at work right now, planning a number of events at Centenary College throughout the course of 2025. So I won't get ahead of that group's announcements, but yeah, a lot of things are being worked on right now.
Yeah, it's gonna be fantastic. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's shift to something that is definitely part of the lore of Shreveport, and that's the plane crash of 1954 that mm-hmm. we hear a lot about. A lot of people say, maybe we struggle with self-esteem issues or have struggled with some momentum, and maybe a lot of that can be traced back or originated with this plane crash of 1954. So my question for you is, can you tell me a little bit about the loss of your grandfather and this plane crash that occurred in 1954?
Yeah. Well, as you alluded to, there are those who say that the economic trajectory of our community changed dramatically with that crash, and I'm sure it certainly had a negative impact on our community, but it certainly, I don't think it was as large of an economic holocaust as some might imply, but it certainly was very impactful on our family. So that plane crash occurred in January of 1954. My grandfather, John Baxter Atkins Jr., if you're talking, who was junior to the first gentleman we were discussing, but But my grandfather, my dad's father.
This is the gentleman who we were discussing, son who passed.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. Let me just go. The original John Baxter, the person we were originally speaking of, that John Baxter Atkins died in Shreveport in 1923, I think it was, at age 59. And then this is his son, who was born in 1899, I think, in Lake Inn, Louisiana, and then moved up with his dad when they moved to Shreveport. And so when his father died, I'll just call him the second John Atkins, took over for his father and continued with. I missed a key point that I overlooked earlier in that discussion. If I go back to the original gentleman we're talking about, the one who brought Centenary, who helped to bring Centenary to Shreveport, So they had, when Centenary got back, when Centenary was brought to Shreveport, they were working for. It wasn't all altruistic. It was partly a business scheme, because they had this 260 acres that they needed to find a reason, find something to make it different, to make it unique, and to enhance the development of it. So that was a big reason why he was recruiting Centenary College. At the same time, he was talking to the city leadership about about bringing the streetcar all the way down to that location, from downtown all the way down, because that was kind of that was out in the country at the time. And so, he was working on enhancing the value of his property. It's, like these days you might build a golf course and then use that to enhance the value of the property around it. In those days, they built a college. And
one other question, just there, his brother's name, the original, do you know what?
It's escaping my mind right now. Yeah. But, so that got him, the development kind of got him back on his feet, got him back on his feet. But what was really the larger economic success was the fact that he was involved with a syndicate that helped to put together a group to run a natural gas pipeline from Caddo Pine Island, where natural gas was a waste product. They ran a gas pipeline from Caddo Pine Island to the city of Shreveport, the first gas pipeline to the city of Shreveport, and had the charter to provide both residential and commercial gas to the city of Shreveport. And that's what got him back, rolling. And then later he also was involved with a group that developed the community of Cedar Grove, which was originally designed as a kind of an industrial center, for factory workers, and there was a gas plant there, there was a refinery there, a number of operational entities were there. So he was involved with a number of things through the course of his life. So now back to his son. So when my great-grandfather died, he was pretty engaged in the pipeline business and the transportation and refining of oil and natural gas liquids. And so that's kind of where his son became involved, John Baxter Atkins. We'll just call this one Junior for the ease of what's the word? Temporal timelines. And so John Baxter Atkins Jr. was very involved with helping to build out a pipeline network. The Shreveport El Dorado Pipeline Company was one of the companies they operated. He was the chairman of Atlas Refining at the time of the plane crash, and involved with a company called the Parade Company, a natural gas processing facility in East Texas. So he was a big networker and kind of he was kind of an outside man, kind of that, to build the relationships and connect the various dots and put the deals together. And so he spent a fair amount of time at the Shreveport Country Club on the golf course, and he liked to play cards, and he wasn't really a big duck hunter, but on this particular fateful weekend, he was on a duck hunting trip in South Louisiana, with one of the pipeline companies, and there was two Weisses, I believe, on the trip, and a Hargrove, and Aquirby's, as well as Mr. Braniff from Braniff Airline and Mr. Tobin from the Tobin map industry. Anyone who's been in the oil and gas business is familiar with Tobin maps. And then there was another guy named Abbott who was a rancher and banker out of Nebraska. And I'll try to remember to come back to Mr. Abbott here in a minute. But anyway, so they were down there playing cards, and there were 2 company planes that had taken them down there and were waiting to bring them back. And they were amphibious Grumman Mallards was the type of aircraft. And the pilot saw that the weather was getting worse in North Louisiana, or got news that the weather was getting worse in North Louisiana. So they came into the camp house and said, "Hey, we better get going. The weather's getting bad." And my grandfather was at the card table, and there were he was like 8 or 9 of them at the card table, and a few of them milling around. And so the guys that weren't playing cards took the first plane, and the guys that were playing cards finished their hand and packed up and took the second plane. Well, the first plane made it safely. The second plane got caught in a weather inversion, and the wings iced up, and they started losing altitude. And remember, it was an amphibious plane, so they tried, in desperation, they tried to put down in Wallace Lake. But if you've been to Wallace Lake, it's not exactly open, and it's not a great open place to land, even for an amphibious aircraft. And the plane exploded, and everybody was killed. So my dad was, I think he was a sophomore at Tulane when in that January, and he was in his room studying for a test, and one of his, it was in the fraternity house, and one of his fraternity brothers came in and said, "Bill, I've just heard a news announcement on the radio that a plane has crashed, and I'm afraid your father may have been on the plane." And about that time, the phone rings in the fraternity house, and it's my mom calling. It was my grandmother calling my dad and telling him about the crash, and she wouldn't let him fly home. She made him take the train home, so that's how that occurred. And the community did certainly lose a lot of leadership, but I think that void was filled fairly quickly, as it usually is. Our family kind of had to readjust and reorient. And my father was still in college. He finished college and spent a few years in the Air Force before he came to work with the family business. But he had an older brother, the other John, the third John Atkins, and he was kind of keeping the ship moving after their father died. But an interesting kind of sidebar conversation on Mr. Abbott. Bear with me here, because this does seem like I'm really taking us offline, but I play in this golf junket where these 8 American guys play these 8 Scottish guys, and my friend Jamie Moreland, he was the one who recruited me into this group 20 years ago, and he's been in it like for another 5 or 10 years prior to that, because he lived in D.C. at one time with a bunch of young guys when they were all right out of college, and they shared house, lived in the same houses, and they had these 2 Scottish friends who would come to visit, and that relationship developed into this Ryder Cup deal where these 8 American guys play these 8 Scottish guys. Well, one of the American guys is Chris Van Horn, and he lives in D.C. and the only reason I know Chris is because he knew Jamie and when they were in their 20s. And we all play in this golf deal. But anyway, several years after I met Chris Van Horn, he calls me and says, "Atco," that's my nickname up there, and he goes, "Atco, are you related to John Baxter Atkins? And did he die in a plane crash?" And I'm like, "Yeah." This is kind of a weird question, but yeah, that's my grandfather. Why do you ask? And he goes, "Because I'm helping my great aunt clean out her attic, and I ran across a news article that or maybe he's helping his aunt clean out her attic, and he ran across a news article talking about how his great uncle died in this plane crash, and it was the guy Abbott, who was a rancher and banker in Nebraska, and how this guy ended up on this duck hunting trip with all these guys from Louisiana and Texas, I don't know. But it's a small world when relatives of two different guys who didn't even know each other, make that connection. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was there I may be wrong about, was there a Ewing on that parish too?
I think there was. That rings a bell with me, but I can't say for sure. It's been a while since I've read that article, but yeah, that does ring a bell.
Is this something you heard a lot about growing up? Like, is this?
Not particularly, no.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna shift. Hopefully, I can pronounce these big words correctly. But my next question is: talk to me, if you could, about how a former Conoco geophysicist and McKinsey consultant, that's you, ends up in the timber business.
Yeah, it was kind of a circuitous path, and the fact that my life had a number of turns in it encourages me to encourage young people to think really hard about what they really want to do and what their skill sets are and what motivates them early in life. I mean, high school and college, because, it's funny. I mean, one's career path is set, or at least the initial trajectory of one's career path begins when you're a freshman or a sophomore in college trying to figure out what you're going to major in. And that decision dictates maybe the next 10 years of your life. And so I was pretty focused as a young guy, and still am, but I was pretty focused, and I woke up one day as a freshman in college. I'm like, oh no, I've got to figure out what I'm going to do. What do I want to do with my life? And so, you only know what you know, and I'm like, and I was kind of torn between, do I want to pursue I'd always been interested in the military. Do I want to pursue a military path? Do I want to pursue a commercial path? And if I want to pursue a commercial path, what do I do? And so, I'm struggling with these questions, and taking ROTC, and trying to figure out what I was going to do long term. And I started looking around, well, if I want to do the commercial path, what path do I want to take? And so I look around Shreveport in the early 80s, and the people that did well were doctors, lawyers, accountants, and oil and gas guys. And so I'm like, well, I don't have the memory to be a doctor. I've never been able to remember. Like, my wife has she's an heir of she's has the genes of the Mac doctor family. She just has a wonderful memory. I just can't retain all that stuff. And then, so I didn't want to be a doctor. And then lawyer, I am or was or am dyslexic, so spelling has always been a challenge. So, and this is before spell check. Spell check changed my life, but this before spell check. So I'm like, I can't be a lawyer. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll be an accountant, or maybe I'll be an oil and gas guy. So that was all that decision, that thought process all went on when I was a freshman in college. So sophomore year, I decided I'm going to go back and I'm going to major I'm going to take accounting, and I'm going to take geology, and whichever I do best in, or whichever I like the most to do best in, that's what I'm going to do. So accounting has its own unique logic, and I think I'm a logical guy. I think I'm a rules-oriented guy. I thought accounting would work well for me, but the logic just didn't really work that well for me. But I'd had geology in high school, so I kind of had a leg up, and geology made a lot of sense to me, and I always enjoyed depositional systems, like the erosion of mountains, and the deposition of that sediment downstream, and offshore bar deposits and point bars in rivers and Aeolian sand dunes and stuff like that. So unlike a lot of geologists who like rocks, I didn't really like rocks. I liked the depositional systems, which works out well for oil and gas, because most oil and gas, if you're in a clastic environment, most oil and gas is deposited in sandbars or offshore bars, or sand dunes, or subsurface marine bars. But anyway, so I decided I was going to major in geology, and I talked to some geologists here in town, and they said, well, if you want to pursue a career in geology, actually I talked to Harry Jared, who's my dad's business partner, who was a geologist, and he says, if you want to get involved with oil and gas, you're going to need to get a master's degree, and then you're going to need to go to work for a major for a few years, and then go from there. And so I'm like, gosh, all right, so I'm going to graduate when I'm 22, and then I've got to do another 2 years for a graduate degree, and then I need to find a job with an oil and gas company. And I'm like, there's no real room for the military service in here, because if I did military service, that might be 5 years ahead of that. And when you're 20 years old and making these kind of decisions, 5 years seems like an eternity. I mean, it's a quarter of your life when you're 20 years old. So I had to put the kind of military desire to serve aside and focus on this commercial goal. And so I was able to, I got a master. I was able to finish my degree at Washington Lee in geology, and then I went to the University of Texas in Austin for a master's in geological sciences, where I studied depositional systems and also took some seismic stratigraphy classes, which is the interpretation of seismic data. Seismic data is geophysical data, mapping the subsurface with sound waves. So coincidentally, I interviewed with Conoco when it came time for full-time employment, and Conoco coincidentally likes to hire geologists who've had some experience interpreting seismic data. They like to hire those people as geophysicists and then train them on the more technical sides of geophysics. So I got much to my surprise, I got an offer to be an associate geophysicist with Conoco.
And what is a geophysicist, like, just for the layperson out there?
A geophysicist, there's two types of geophysicists. The first type is the geophysicist that focuses on acquiring geophysical data, acquiring sonic data, and putting it into a format that can be interpreted by an interpreted geophysicist, which is the second type. But so what a geophysicist does is they send sound waves. At the simplest level, they explode dynamite on the surface. It sends sound waves down into the subsurface, and at various layers, when you get a change in from one layer of rock to another layer of rock, there's an interface there, and sound waves will often ricochet off that interface and come and travel back to the surface. So they've got these geophones strung out across the surface, and when they set off that explosion on the surface, they see how much time it took that sound wave. They know how fast the sound wave is traveling, and then that sound wave is coming back up to the surface to the geophone, and so that's two-way travel time down to the interface and then back up. So they can calculate roughly how far it is down to that interface and then back up. So when you do this if you lay out a string and you do it 100 times, you get a bunch of different data points, like tracking this one particular interface. Now, as things get more sophisticated, they're able to track multiple interfaces. So you get a display of the subsurface that gives you some indication of how the rocks are structured beneath the surface. So you can get kind of an image of the subsurface through the seismic data. And then to take it to the next level, these days they take a square area and they shoot a grid. A grid pattern across that area, and they're able to actually get a three-dimensional image of the subsurface. So you've got the acquiring geophysicists who acquire and then process all those two-way travel times into the subsurface illustration, and then you have the interpretive geophysicists who then take that data and try to figure out what it's telling them about where oil and gas may exist in the subsurface. So I was a geophysicist for 4 years with Conoco.
In Austin? Or?
No, I was in Oklahoma City for 3 years working in the Michigan Basin, believe it or not. I didn't even know that when I was in all that time studying geology, I didn't even know that that there was a Michigan Basin, but that was my first area of responsibility, was the Michigan Basin. And so I worked the Michigan Basin, some out in West Oklahoma, and then I got transferred to Lafayette and spent my last year in Lafayette. But the industry was still moving kind of slow at the time. This is in the late 80s into the early 90s. And I'd always kind of wanted to work up through the technical ranks into more of a management role. And the consulting firms had come in and flattened Conoco's organizational structure. It was the right move to make. They made all these cross-functional teams where you have reservoir engineers and production engineers and geoscientists all on the same team focused on a certain field or a certain exploratory area. But in so doing, they took levels of management out and made it a more efficient and effective thing. But while doing that, that was good for the company, good for the shareholders, but it kind of took out my pathway. So I thought, well, I think if I could get into a good business school, I think I might go to business school and kind of diversify my skill set a little bit, because I felt like I was really narrow. And coming from a family of businessmen, when they start talking about IRRs and discounted cash flows and multiples on invested capital, I didn't know all that lingo, and I always kind of felt a little out of touch. So, and again, I'd been very focused for a long time on geology and then geophysics. And I knew I didn't want to be a technical guy. So I went to business school kind of seeking divine intervention to tell me what I was meant to do. And so I opened up the aperture on my view of the world, and kind of really took a swath of different classes. I ended up with a triple major in finance, management, strategy, and organizational behavior, because I was just kind of out there, looking for what I really loved. Didn't really find it, but at least I had a much broader perspective. So, again, I went to business school looking for divine intervention, but at the end of the day, it never really struck. So what does one do when they're coming out of business school and they don't have divine intervention? Well, they join a consulting firm and, wait for divine intervention to strike again, wait for some more time for divine intervention to strike. So I got an offer to work for a large consulting firm called A.T. Kearney, which was one of the old name management consulting firms, international firm out of Chicago. And I was offered a job in their energy practice out of Dallas. So I worked for them for 3 years, and then I moved over to McKinsey and spent 4 years at McKinsey. Again, looking for divine intervention.
Still in Dallas at that point?
I was living in Dallas, but I was working wherever your clients are. So I spent a lot of time, and I spent more time in Oklahoma than I ever thought I would. As you know, this is another sidebar here, but as you know, my first job was with Conoco. My first consulting gig very first consulting gig in year one of consulting was working for Phillips Petroleum Company in Bartlesville. And then 7 years later, my last consulting gig was on the management team that merged, the upstream team that merged Conoco and Phillips. So I started with Conoco, first job out of school. First consulting gig was Phillips, and my last consulting gig was merging Conoco and Phillips. So it was funny how much time I ended up spending in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and Ponca City, Oklahoma, and some places like that. So after 7 years of consulting, so I'm getting on a plane every Sunday night, Monday morning if I'm lucky, and I'm getting back every Friday afternoon or Thursday night if I'm lucky. Or I spent 3 months in Beijing, several month-long tranches in London or the Netherlands, or Artesia, New Mexico, and things like that. So it was a great experience. I learned a lot. It was good for me, especially as an introvert, as someone who's an introvert at the core. It was good to force me out of my comfort zone and always be put into new situations with new problems. So that was good for me. But I knew it wasn't really what I was meant to do. I always wanted to kind of run something or manage something. And so by this time I'm like 39, and I'm like, what am I going to do when I grow up? Divine intervention still hadn't occurred. And so I decided it was time to go back home. Shreveport was always home, and I always hoped I could figure out a way to get back home, but I didn't really have a clear game plan. I just figured that if I came home and applied myself, that we could find an opportunity. So,
and let me just stop one second. Sibling, why you have two siblings, three siblings?
3 siblings. There's 4 of us in total.
And tell me who they are and where
there's
you rank.
Allison, my sister, the artist who lives in Miami. There's Susanna, my second sister, who's kind of the connector of us. She's the one who keeps the family together and keeps us all remembering that we've got brothers and sisters, and keep us all in the loop. She lives in Baton Rouge, and then my brother Will, who you know, and then I'm the last.
Okay.
But Will, he was not working in the family business because he'll tell you he's not, administration is not his thing. He's kind of an outside guy, kind of an idea guy, and he really wasn't interested in administrative detail, which I really respect. I mean, the worst thing is to have someone who tries to do something they don't want to do, or that's not their forte. So I've always respected my brother for not trying to be something that wasn't a good fit for him. But my dad was still running the business, and my cousin Ed Crawford was running the business. He and Dad were partners, as you know, and so they didn't need another guy, and they already had their staff and their team. And Mark Morgan had been with the family business for 20 plus years by that time. And
we're in the early 2000s.
We're at 2023. 2003. And so I came home with the goal of trying to find a private equity type opportunity where you've got a company in this region, in our community or our region that's going through transition, where you have a founder, let's say, that doesn't have a clear transition plan, doesn't have a clear successor, and try to acquire that company and move forward in that way. And the Atco team, my dad and my cousin Ed were kind enough to let me kind of camp out at the office and start learning more about what was going on in our family office on a day-to-day basis, while simultaneously working with Mark Morgan, who was our kind of chief operating officer at the family office, to try to find this private equity type opportunity. And I sent out letters to accountant, every accountant and attorney that we could identify in the region, and people were kind enough to refer us to some opportunities, but we could never find the right company at the right price. If the price was right, the company had some real issues. If the company was doing well, the price was unreasonable. So periodically, Mark Morgan and I would shake our head and think, well, this isn't working. What else? What other opportunities are out there? And about this time, there had been we became aware of this change that had been developing in the timberland space, where the large forest product companies were disinvesting, were selling their timberland tracts out from their own portfolios. And it was being driven largely by the investment bankers. The investment bankers are like, look, you've got this land, like talking to International Paper, you've got this land in your portfolio. It's been in your portfolio for 100 years. It's valued at $5 an acre. It's worth $2,500 an acre. You can sell it, take that big, one-time gain. That'll flow through to the corporate balance sheets, and then that positive bump on the corporate balance sheets will translate to a nice bonus for you and your comp structure. I should say it will lead to an increase in the stock price, and that will lead to a bump in your compensation. So that led to this whole change in the ownership of timberland in the U.S. And we kind of figured that, well, Mark was noticing some transactions occurring, and we started digging into those, and we became aware of this timber investment management organization structure where these properties were being sold by the companies and being picked up by these private partnerships. Another advantage of the private partnership is that there's a single taxation at the private partnership level, whereas when these properties in the corporate structure, there's a double taxation. So Mark had been buying some properties for our family and for our personal family portfolio over the years, and he loved timberland, and he had built up his own personal timberland portfolio on like nights and weekends. So he had a lot of knowledge of that space, and I had through my consulting experience, I was able to understand the market and kind of explain that market on paper and model it out and explain why this is a good investment and what we can expect from it. And then with the blessing of a family with a long history of business involvement in our community, I was blessed with relationships and family reputation that allowed Mark and I in particular to build out that. Ed Crawford was the third founding partner, because what Ed provided was he was allowing Mark, who really worked for Ed and my dad, to work with me in building this out. So through that, he ended up with an equity stake and provided a lot of high-level perspective and insights as well. So we founded Louisiana Timber Partners 20 years ago, and through the blessings of having many local partners support us. I mean, there's numerous local families that you're aware of that have been supportive of us, and we're very thankful for that. And we try to show our appreciation by communicating with them honestly, consistently, and looking after their capital as if it were our own, because it is our own, and we're putting capital in beside our partners. So that's all helped our model. So that's a long story about how a former geophysicist and consultant ends up being in the timber business.
But super fascinating. You
might ask, well, why didn't you start an oil and gas fund? Because that's where my background was. But I really didn't. First of all, in 2003, the energy markets were in a bit of a flux, and this was pre-Haynesville days, and I didn't want to have to call investors and tell them. I knew how risky the oil business was, especially drilling. Trying to drill a traditional four-way closure or a stratigraphic trap. I knew that most of those had been found, and it's tough to find new ones. Again, this is before the resource play came around, but I didn't want to I didn't want to get investor commitments and then lose their money in a dry hole. That's all legit. Everybody knows they're taking a risk, when they do it. But that wasn't the path I wanted to take. And so it worked out well that we found the timber space.
And tell me just quickly, so Atco, which you mentioned earlier, was the business that was run by Bill, your father, and Ed. Bill, your father, passed in what year? In
2011.
Okay, and so you're part of Atco today, is that right?
Yeah.
And just talk to me kind of Atco in 2024 and John Atkins in 2024.
Well, let me just go back to kind of how things transitioned from. So when I came back in 2003, Atco, we had my dad and Ed Crawford were the two partners in Atco. Mark Morgan was the chief operating officer. And Ed said, John, we'd love to have you. We'd love to have you remain here in our community, but we don't have room for you here in our organization. But we're happy to support you in trying to find a new opportunity. So that's when they, let me hang out in the conference room and basically gave me some of Mark's time to help lead me and mentor me and look for opportunities. And so once we found some property, once we acquired some properties, once we put our business model together, collected investors, and then went out and were able to identify and negotiate and acquire properties, Mark is like, I think I have more passion for this timber business than I do for being the chief operating officer at Atco. So over the course of time, Mark evolved into being the managing partner at Louisiana Timber Partners, where he spends most of his time and effort. And my connection to Louisiana Timber Partners evolved more into an investor relations kind of role, where I raise capital when we need it and keep our investors informed and updated while simultaneously being involved with the bigger decisions at Louisiana Timber Partners. Meanwhile, my day-to-day task moved back over more to kind of fill the void that Mark left at Atco Investment Company when he moved over to LTP. And we're all connected, and we all have the same office suite, so we're all connected and we're cross-pollinated and share. But as far as share and help, but as far as more formal roles, I moved more into the ATCO day-to-day side, and Mark moved more into the LTP day-to-day side. And then as my father got older, he turned to me one day and said, "Hey, I think I want to be fully retired by the time I'm 75." And I guess he was 72 at the time. And by this time, Ed was benefiting from Louisiana Timber Partners, so he was willing to let me, move into the team. And so I started buying. I had a 3-year buyout with my dad's half of the management company. Our family office, Atco Investment Company, is just the management company. The assets that lie under that management company, that are managed by that management company, are owned by all of our siblings and cousins through various family partnerships. So that's how that evolved. So today, I wear 3 hats. I'm a partner in Atco Investment Company. I'm a founder and partner in Louisiana Timber Partners, and then I'm your servant at the Parish Commission.
And the partners in ATCO today are you,
Ed and me. That's
okay.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And now Robert Crawford, Ed's son, one of Ed's 4 sons, has been with us for 10 plus years now, and he's our chief investment officer. So at some point, he'll move into a partner role, and hopefully our family entity will continue on. We've got it planned out for another 20 or so years, and I don't know, beyond that, it's kind of hard to predict what happens. But hopefully, we're working to keeping our group together for a long time. I will say Chris Farrell has joined our group as a chief financial officer, and he's been a big help to us. Really kind of upgraded our back office to a large degree.
Awesome. No, it's all super informative, and I appreciate all the backstory. So I do want to shift. We're going to come back to your role with the parish in a little bit, but I do want to talk a little bit more about your mom and dad. So like you, your mom and dad, Ruth and Bill, both were very engaged members of our community. Tell me, if you could, a little bit about what you may have learned from each of them.
Well, my mom and dad were very different people, as you probably are aware. I mean, my dad was very, I learned discipline, structure, and commitment and loyalty from my dad. My mom, I learned joy and happiness and how to have fun, and they balanced each other out well. My mom made sure my dad had some fun, and my dad made sure my mom, had a home to come to, every day, and looked after the more financial aspects of our lives.
And she was the extrovert, he was the introvert.
Yeah. And Dad, I guess Dad would be. I was about to say, I don't know if Dad was an introvert, but he was pretty introverted. Yeah. And Mom loved to party and loves people, and could just go. But so by watching my dad, I guess that's where I always. I guess it goes. My dad watched his father and grandfather and their involvement in both business and community, and so then my dad was involved with both the business and community, and so it's just natural that as I grew up, and I will say the same trend occurs in the Crawford family. I mean, Ed Crawford and his family are wonderful public servants, and Katie Weir, who's Ed's sister, they're all wonderful members of the community. So I think it's just been a trait that's been passed down from family to family as we've kind of progressed in our time here in Shreveport-Bossier.
Do you think it was osmosis, or do you think it was obligation or hammered into you? Or
it was not hammered in. There were examples that were set, and we observed the examples. And fortunately, we're not a very rebellious crowd. We don't have a lot of rebels that say, "I'm not doing that." I mean, my sisters are really good with supporting the community, supporting this community too, although they don't even live here anymore, but they're still very good at supporting our home community. And my brother Will is very helpful in all aspects of that, and does a lot of his own financial or charitable work and financial contributions to various entities around the community. So I think you learn it, through it's cultural. I think is probably the best way to say it. Things you observe in your life that you absorb and pass on. And that's one reason I think why we've been able to keep our family group together for so long, because Dad kind of educated us about the benefits of keeping our family group together. You have greater scale, you have access to better opportunities, you're a bit more diversified. So
he would say these things to you?
Yeah. And so we've benefited. The later generations have benefited from the lessons that were taught to us as we were younger by the previous generations, and we try to convey those same messages to the next generation.
But it wasn't as much, I expect you to do this, or I expect you to do that.
No, it's funny. I never got, I expect you. Dad, it was actually the opposite. Dad was like, sometimes I wish he'd been more directive, but he was fairly, I don't want to say laissez-faire, but he was cautious about the direction he gave, because his father was very directive, and he didn't want to be overly directive to us. I think he felt like his dad was overly directive to him, because his dad had a plan for him, and he was going to go to Tulane. Well, first he was supposed to go to Washington and Lee, but Dad went to Swanee Military Academy, which was all males up in the mountains, and Washington and Lee was all males up in the mountains. And so when he was finishing Swanee, he's like, Dad, I know you want me to go to Washington and Lee, but I just spent 3 years. I think he went up there as a sophomore. He said, I just spent 3 years in the mountains with a bunch of guys. I really don't want to go to spend another 4 years in the mountains with a bunch of guys. Can I maybe go somewhere else? And he said, let's see what it'll take you at this late hour, because it was probably like March of his senior year or something. But anyway, he got into Tulane, and his dad said, you're going to major in engineering, because remember, his dad was involved with all this pipeline and refining work, and so Dad started taking engineering classes, and like at midterm reviews his freshman year, Dad said he got something like a 29 or something like that on his exam, and his dad got word of his poor performance and came down to Tulane to meet with the professor and said, "What's wrong with this kid? Is he not going to class? Is he screwing off? What's going on?" And he's like, if he's going to be an engineer, he really needs to buckle down and get to work. And the professor says, "Sir, not everybody is meant to be an engineer." So Dad has always appreciated that professor for getting him off the hook. Dad just wasn't meant to be an engineer, just like I wasn't meant to be an accountant. So Dad majored in economics, and it all worked out fine. But all that to say, Dad's father was very directive. So my father was less directive. But back to the original story that we started out with, sometimes I wished he'd helped me to have been more reflective on where my strengths were and where my weaknesses were, and what really motivated me, and what might I do best in. And maybe it's too early to tell when people are in high school, but I really do think I encourage all parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents to help their young people think through. Don't let wind just blow people through their career. Help them to develop a plan that's a good match for their desires and their capabilities and their skill sets.
But I will, not to push back too much, but yes, you went through several iterations to get where you are today, but there were lessons learned and traits. There were skills
and capabilities that were developed along the way, and maybe that's how it's meant to be. Maybe that is the best path, and maybe that was my best path. I've got one or two I wouldn't say, maybe I've got one or two regrets where if you could do it all back over again, how I might have made a tweak here or a tweak there. But generally, I can't complain about the opportunities that I was able to pursue and the lessons I learned from those opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So just sticking with your family for a second, my next question is, as we've discussed, your family has actively, historically, presently, currently supported our community philanthropically for decades. And decades isn't 2 or 3 decades. Decades is almost centuries plus. So my question is, just talk a little bit about what your personal areas of interest are and why.
Well, I spend most of my charitable time and contributions associated with Centenary, Southfield, Barksdale, and then a distant fourth is maybe LSU HSC. Now, there's a lot of other things that we support, both individually, both Lindsay and I, and as a family, that we support every year, but just not at the same level. Obviously, we've talked about the connection with Centenary. Centenary is a wonderful academic institution. It needs our support. When I say the large community support. We just saw Birmingham Southern just closed this week. And Centenary's in strong financial condition, because it's blessed with an adequate endowment. But nothing can go on forever unless it's supported. So our community really needs to get behind Centenary and support it. I think the college is on a good trajectory with football, and it's funny when you talk about adding football to a college, and that's going to, you don't think of an academic institution as being improved by a football program, but football has brought in 100 extra kids to Centenary, and they bring a new energy and a new perspective, and hopefully it'll translate into some new energy behind Centenary for our whole community. So our family as a group, and Lindsay and I individually, support Centenary to a high level. We also, as a family and individually, support Southfield because Southfield's been key to not only the Atkins family but the Crawford family as well. My dad sent 4 kids through Southfield, served on the board for decades. He paid 57 years of Southfield tuition, and you're like, well, how? Southfield's only K4 through 8th grade. How could he pay 57 years of Southfield tuition? Well, back then it was K4 through 12th grade, and you're still like, well, 4 times 14, K4 through 12th is 14 years times 4 kids. That's 56 years of tuition. What's wrong here? Where's the math? And I'm like, well, one of us went through first grade twice. So that's how we got to 57. But my dad paid 57 years of Southfield tuition. So it's been a part of our family for a long time. It's a wonderful private school opportunity here in our community. There are other good schools too. Lindsay's went to St. Mark's, and she is loyal to St. Mark's to the core. That's one reason we never had kids, because we didn't want to have to fight over where they went to school.
And Southfield, like Centenary, probably also relies on the community and don't take it for granted.
Right, because none of these institutions are divinely blessed with being here forever. They all need support. The third area of support is Barksdale. I made reference to my early interest in military service, and I feel badly not having served in uniform. That's kind of one of the regrets I have in my life. But so I've tried to be supportive of the military through other ways, and so I've been involved with the MAC and the 8th Air Force Consultation Committee and Barksdale Forward, and have supported the base through various opportunities through those organizations. One of which I try to find ways to introduce friends to friends and support multiple organizations with the same dollar. So we established a an endowment at Southfield for Barksdale military families. So that provides some, financial support to Barksdale families that want to attend Southfield, and at the same time for Southfield, it brings in this new blood, this new perspective, these people that are kind of from service-oriented families whose families sacrifice each time they move to a new location. When I say families, the spouses and kids. So I think that's good for the Barksdale families to have that have this as an option of their many educational options in our community. But it's also good for Southfield to benefit from those families. So it's a symbiotic relationship that I think has worked out pretty well. And then LSU-HSC, of course, is a key part of our community with all the doctors that they bring in and the medical care that they provide us and the research that they complete. So those are probably the four entities that I focus most on. But again, there are many others that we support at a lesser degree.
Yes, you guys are a tremendous force in this community.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's move now. You hinted a little bit at your third responsibility these days, or your third profession. So since 2016, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you've served on the Caddo Parish Commission. So my question for you is...
Wait a minute. Let's see. I've just finished my eighth year. Yeah, so 2016, right.
Yeah, so my question for you, and I think this could be helpful to other young people trying to figure out what their connection is to our community, what their responsibility and duty is to our community. My question is, what compels one of our community leaders like you to make the time to serve like you have?
Well, it's back to that service aspect. I mean, I saw it in my dad. I saw it in our family. I've always had that unscratched itch of having not served in a more formal way through the military or some other formal method.
Are you the first in your larger family to have a political role, or other figures in Atkins?
The only one. Allegedly, there was a county commissioner in Tennessee somewhere back, decade, in the 1800s. But to my knowledge, I'm the only one who's run for public office in recent years. So it was an interesting, when I was at Conoco, I read a Stephen Covey book that was real popular in the late 80s, early 90s, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And after reading that book, somewhere in that book, it encouraged you to write down your goals, which I did. I wrote them down on a 3x5 index card in red ink. I don't know why, it was just having the pen I had. And there were like professional goals, like where you want to be professionally, like in the organization, like organizationally. And then there were financial goals, and then there were service goals, and then there was like health. And I wrote down my goals. I can't remember all the specifics, but I wrote down those goals, and including in those goals was to serve my community. And I guess that was because I had watched my dad serve our community. And but I carried that card for like 30 years. I recently I was probably 55, and I looked at it. I'm like, I think I can probably throw this away now, because a lot of them were out of date. I mean, kind of I fulfilled those goals, and time moved on.
Did you throw it away?
I did, yeah.
Did you take a picture of it before you threw it away?
No, I didn't. Okay. I should have, but anyway, on those goals was to make a positive impact on my community. So, that was a lesson that I must have taken from my father, and so it's always been. But I would look at that card every year, and so that service was always part of what I wanted to do. And you can't really. That was part of the reason I came back home to Shreveport, because selling days through McKinsey, you can't go do many other things. You can't get involved with other things. And I knew I needed to make a change if I wanted service to become part of that. So I've been fortunate in that earlier in my career I focused largely on my profession. I was late to get married, so I was able to do that. And then after I reached like age 40, I was able to start building more service components in, and like Southfield School Board and the Committee 100 and things of that nature, and leadership in those roles. And then eventually, I just decided I thought that it was time to try something else, and something in a more formal way through the political process. And I'm not very political. I'm not a glad hander or a backslapper per se. So the political process is not easy for me. But I enjoy the service, and I enjoy trying to be helpful. I don't say a lot at commission meetings. I listen a lot, and if I need to make a public point, I'll make it there at the commission meeting. But otherwise, I'll reach out to whoever I need to talk to, on the commission staff or one of the directors, and ask them to look into something for me, which they are very good and very kind to do. And the parish does a wonderful job. Actually, I think the parish has a good team and has good staff, and they're always responsive to requests, and that helps us be responsive to our constituents. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I'm not sure exactly what the question was, but
just what compelled someone like you, who certainly has no obligation,
But I do have an obligation, because service is part of our DNA. So I felt an obligation to try it, and I'm glad I did. I encourage everybody to spend a little time in a public office. It's educational. It's broadening. You see things from a different perspective. You can understand how decisions are made at a higher level, because kind of the dynamics are the same, kind of up and down. This is junior. I call it junior varsity, but it's the dynamics are the fundamentals are the same. I'm sure. I can't. Poor Mike Johnson. I don't know how he can keep all those balls in the air. That's got to be so complex. But they say all politics are local, and I think that's true. But you see how government works. You see how other parts of your community work and the challenges that they're facing, and you learn to work, with those people to try to solve common goals. Other parts of our community, I'm blessed to be in one of the more affluent parts of the parish, but there are a lot of parts of our parish that need help, and I'm certainly willing to help when I think it's a worthy goal that's addressing a broad enough swath of our community where it seems fair. If we get, the more narrow we get, then that feels less fair, and then I'm less comfortable. But it's been a good experience. And I encourage everybody to give it a try.
And not only that, I would just, from my end, having done it, I haven't served, but I would encourage everyone to attend some commission meetings, just to get a feel for what it even is, and how the process unfolds, and what it looks and feels like.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't think I'd ever been to a commission meeting prior to me deciding that that in a year I'm going to run for that spot, and then I started going to meetings and just watching and listening and trying to understand how it all worked, and then Mike Thibodeau, who had the seat, who had District 9, who occupied District 9 before I came in, he when I first took the seat, he was kind enough to mentor me and coach me along the way, and I'm very grateful for the help he gave me in those early days.
Well, John, those are my set questions today. As I told you before we started, if there was anything I didn't hit, I was going to come back to you.
I think we're good.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you making the time, and I appreciate everything you do and have done.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.